Today, we're going to be going over question 46 of the Westminster Shorter Catechism, which you can find in your Trinity hymnal on page 668, if I'm not mistaken. Now, the question asks us this: what is required in the first commandment? The answer: the first commandment requireth us to know and acknowledge God to be the only true God and our God, and to worship and glorify him accordingly. So there are 3 points that the divines want us to understand in regards to what's required of us in this first commandment. And those 3 points, or those 3 things that we are to keep in mind, is we are to know God, we are to acknowledge God, and we are to worship and glorify God. And what I'd like to do today is go over each of these 3 points with you. So the first requirement in this commandment is to know that the God of the Scriptures not only exists, but is the only true and living God. Those who deny the very existence of God are referred to as fools in the Bible. See, for example, Psalm chapter 14, verse 1 and Psalm 53, verse 1, which says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." See, just believing that a God exists should not be what we're aiming at. For as we can clearly see, the Scriptures don't even regard highly those who reject him. We must not only embrace the existence of God, but also the reality of the one true God who has revealed himself in the Scriptures. For if all we do is aim at a belief in a generic God, we can easily fall into the idolatrous trap of many false religions. For example, Muslims believe in God, Jehovah's Witnesses believes in God, Hindus believe in many gods. So to believe that there is a God may take you out of a camp of a fool, but it does not place you into the camp of a Christian. Psalm chapter 86, verse 10 says, "For you are great and do wondrous things. You alone are God." Isaiah 37, 15 through 16, and Hezekiah prayed to the Lord, "O Lord of hosts, God of Israel, enthroned above the cherubim, you are the God, you alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth." And Jeremiah 10, verse 10 says, "But the Lord is the true God. He is the living God and everlasting King." Not only are we to know this God, we are to acknowledge him as God. Now, I know it sounds kind of redundant saying that we are to know God and acknowledge God, but there is a difference between knowing God and acknowledging God. Listen to the difference in the definition between knowing and acknowledging. To know is to perceive or understand as fact or truth, to apprehend clearly and with certainty. Whereas to acknowledge is to admit to be real or true, recognize the existence, truth, or fact of. So if you notice, the difference between knowing, perceiving and understanding, and acknowledging, admitting it to be real or true is indeed there. I mean, the demons know that God exists. What they refuse to do is acknowledge God as the God to be served. So to merely know that God exists puts you on the same footing as demons. See, an unfaithful husband doesn't deny that he has a wife. He refuses to acknowledge his wife as the one to be cherished and valued, and thus to whom he must keep his vows. A derelict father doesn't deny that he has children. What he does is he refuses to acknowledge his responsibilities in light of the fact of his duties. See, to acknowledge God as God means that we understand what he requires, that he requires something from us more than just a realization that he exists. See, I'd be willing to bet that if we were to walk out right now and just ask people on the road whether or not they believe in God, we'd be pleasantly surprised that a lot of people probably would say that God exists. See, the problem in our culture doesn't lie in the fact of people not believing that there is a God. The problem arises from a refusal to live in light of that fact. Or to put it another way, the problem arises from not actually acknowledging God. See, in light of the fact that we know God to exist, we ought to recognize God as truly God. See, that means that we acknowledge God as our provider. Psalm 104, verse 14 and 15 tells us this: "You cause the grass to grow for the livestock and plants for food to cultivate, that he may bring forth food from the earth, and wine to gladden the heart of man, oil to make his face shine, and bread to strengthen man's heart." We also are to acknowledge God as our lawgiver. Isaiah 33, verse 22 says, "For the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king, he will save us." We are to acknowledge God as sovereign. Psalm 22, verse 8. For kingship belongs to the Lord. He rules over all the nations. Psalm 103, verse 19. The Lord has established his thrones in the heavens, and his kingdom rules over all. We are to acknowledge God as merciful. Psalm 86, verse 15. But you, O Lord, are a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. We are to acknowledge God as just. Psalm 89, verse 14. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. Steadfast love and faithfulness go before you. See, the Israelites believed that God exists. However, they constantly did not acknowledge God as God. They constantly distrusted God to provide for them in the wilderness. They did not trust God to rule over them. They did not trust God to protect them. And we see this throughout the Old Testament. In Exodus, for example, chapter 16, verse 2 and 4, after God brought them out of the land of Egypt, immediately they were questioning God and providing for them as far as food. We even see in 1 Samuel chapter 8, them asking God to provide for them a king, and then God said, you rejected me as your king. So again, not only are we to know God, but we also ought to acknowledge this God as our God. And the third point is that we ought to worship and glorify God accordingly. See, the first point taught us that we are to believe in the one true God. The second point taught us that not only were we to believe in God, but to acknowledge him as God. This third and final point teaches us that in light of the fact that we are to believe in and acknowledge God, now we are to treat and honor him as God. See, what is the point of knowing that I have a wife and acknowledging Deborah to be my wife if I am not treating her as my wife? Likewise, we understand that knowing and acknowledging God as God is vitally important, but however, that acknowledgement is meaningless if we are not truly glorifying God. 1 John 2, verses 3 to 6 says this, and by this we know that we have come to know him if we keep his commandments. Whoever says, I know him, but does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, in him truly the love of God is perfected. By this we may know that we are in him. Whoever says he abides in him ought to walk in the same manner in which he walked. Matthew Henry says this in regards to this particular section. Professors of the truth are often ashamed of their ignorance or ashamed to own it. They frequently pretend to great attainments in the knowledge of divine mysteries. But what knowledge of God can that be which sees not that he is most worthy of the most entire and intense obedience? And if that be seen and known, how vain and superficial is even this knowledge when it sways not the heart unto obedience? A disobedient life is the confutation and shame of pretended religious knowledge. It gives the lie to such boasts and pretenses and shows that there is neither religion nor honesty in them. See, God, being our creator and ruler, demands our worship. To refuse to worship God is to refuse to acknowledge him truly as God. Psalm 29, verse 2, ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. Worship the Lord in the splendor of his holiness. Psalm 95, verses 6 through 7 tells us this. Oh, come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand. Do you see what the psalmist says here? He said, let us worship God. Why? Why are we to worship God? Because he is our God. Since we know him and trust him, we are thus to worship him. When we choose to not worship God, we are ultimately just demonstrating the fact that we never truly knew or trusted in him. So, to conclude, when God tells us, thou shalt have no other gods before me, what that requires from us is to know the one true and living God in order to not worship false gods. When God tells us, thou shalt have no other gods before me, this also requires that we acknowledge that he alone is truly God and acknowledge all the implications of that fact. And lastly, when God tells us, thou shalt have no other gods before me, this requires that we rightly worship and glorify God, who has revealed himself to us in the scriptures. Now that we know what God requires from us in keeping with the first commandment, next week we will learn exactly what it is that God forbids from us in this commandment.